Hi there, John.
Hi, Kyle. How are you?
First of all, thank you so much for um, taking the time to just speak with me for a little while. I know your dance card is full these days, and so if you see me looking in a different direction, it's because my camera is attached here, but in order to see you, I'm having to look here.
Oh,
So
that's fine. Look where you need
if
to look.
that gets distracting, let me know. But I really wanted to say this to you, and this is one reason why I wanted to do um, a talk like this. You've made some brilliant commentary lately about just the cult of personality, and
Right.
I know you're in a tough position because you're trying to do a thing,
Yeah.
and you're trying to answer for what are we going to say to our descendants about what we did during the meaning crisis? What was our
Yeah.
role
Yeah.
to play? But I hope you take this in the spirit that it's meant as a religious
Yeah.
person, as a theistic Christian. I tell people this, that you come closer, and I know what I'm about to say may sound heretical to some people. You come closer to the Spirit of Christ than almost anyone else I know. That comes across in the work that you do. And I'm not trying to put that
No.
label
No.
on you. I just mean, in one conversation you said there's almost like this bifurcation where all the work that you've done, everything that you've explored, nothing has, even the sort of trauma from your upbringing, it's as if Jesus is set aside from that.
Yeah.
And so that's one thing that I really appreciate, is that as a even as a believer, I struggle to find someone who comes near the Spirit of Christ in that sense. I also think that you're careful enough and you're mature enough at this point that, and I mean mature in the sense that, like, you are settled into your life and you are happy at your university, you're doing your thing, and it's not as though you want to ride a similar type of wave. Not that there's anything wrong with what Dr. Peterson did. I'm just saying, I
Yeah.
don't think that that's what you're after at all. Um, and and again, I think that comes across this notion of uh, an embedded growth obligation that sort of proliferates our socioeconomic system to our academic world, the Matthew principle, the Pareto principle, however you want to look at it,
Right.
this notion that, like, we have to keep, you need to get more numbers. However many
Yeah.
subscribers you have, that isn't enough. Versus you have Christ, and what you typically hear is this messianic question. Why does he tell people, don't don't say anything about the fact that I just healed you of leprosy? Like,
Right.
don't
Yeah.
tell
Yeah.
anyone. Just go and do your thing. So I appreciate that about you, and sort of the ethical stance which you approach these things. And I think that's resonating. And I know that, like, why is it your job? I know this probably right. Like, how did you get like, you're traumatized by this faith, and yet now somehow all of these people are finding such deep meaning in the work that you're doing, and it's drawing them closer to this faith. And so I know that that can't be easy, as I'm
Mm.
imagining. I guess that can't be something that's like, God, if you're there, this is confusing
Yeah.
because why is this the thing that's happening in my life? And I know, it just, one of the things it speaks to is just the outright hunger that people have, that there really is a deep meaning crisis,
Yeah.
and people are just latching hold of any signal in all of the noise, just one solid beacon. If I can find a good point of reference, then I can triangulate from there. You know, if you can just see the sun, you can use your hand to
Yeah,
guide yourself. You can
yeah,
say, like, how much sunlight is left? Like,
yeah,
what part of the meaning crisis are we in? Like,
right.
where are we at? And when I looked on the CDC's webpage a couple days ago, just to check the new guidelines and check to see how things are going with the vaccine rollout, I couldn't believe I saw this, but there's a special page dedicated to the zombie apocalypse. So I thought of you, that just like, it's so pervasive that even the CDC has it
Oh, I didn't know
on
that.
their webpage. It's just
Yeah.
unbelievable. But I've said a lot, and so I'll, please feel
Well,
free to.
I'd kind of like to dialogue with you about this, Kyle. Um, it's on my heart and on my mind. Um, so I have the great good fortune to be in love with an astonishing woman, beautiful person, beautiful woman. Um, her sort of professed uh, position is atheist, but she's 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 somebody who's deeply moved by music and beauty, um, and she's actually very appreciative of my work. Well, I'm setting up this preamble because I want to make clear, because she said something to me that was analogous. She sort of said to me, we were sitting and talking, and she said, John, I think you're the only true Christian I've ever met.
Right.
And I didn't know what to do with that. And you're saying something similar. And so, I'm not taking that as proof of any truth or anything like that. But what I'm saying is that, people have observed this, and I would like to understand what it is they're pointing to. And I want to somehow figure out how that relates to what I've been talking about. And I don't want to make this primarily about me, because that's one of the things I don't like doing. Right. But because I've been interested in how these two other figures, Socrates and Siddhartha, have actually allowed me to speak in a way about Jesus of Nazareth that Christians find profound, which I find somewhat, I wouldn't say confusing, but almost paradoxical. It's like I turn to these two other figures who I regard as enlightened and who have been and continue to be significant guides in my life. And they've afforded me sort of a stereoscopic insight. And I hope this doesn't sound pretentious. I'm trying to respond to what people are saying. You're not the only one, right? That gives me some insight into and a deepening understanding of Jesus that I don't feel it makes me a Christian, but I also resonate with and respect what people are they're recognizing something in what I say that resonates with them. And I think I'm speaking very carefully here, but I think there's truth to that. And but I'm not clear what that truth is. I'm really not clear what that truth is. And I know, and I get into, I have some of the best dialogues I have are with dialogos. I even get into dialogos are with Christians like J.P. Marceau, Mary Cohen, Paul Vanderklay, Jonathan Pajot, right?
Yeah.
And I found other people who have sort of, not just through me alone, but they've said I've contributed to it. Like Rafe Kelly, he describes himself now as a non-theistic Christian. He used to be an atheist.
Yeah.
It's so there's something going on. Part of it could be that, I feel with the practices I've been developing, and especially the last year or so, 2 years, especially with Christopher Mastropietro and Jordan Hall and Guy Senstock, I've really been involved in a practice in which, I don't know, I don't want to sound creepy here, but the Dialogos is an invocation, an evocation, an exemplification, an instantiation of the Logos. And it's something within and between people, but also beyond them, that connects with sort of the intelligibility of reality. And that's not just my experience, that's an ancient experience. And it's also a new experience in all these emerging I go into these, do the participant observation on all these discourse, authentic relating practices, and I see this, right? I don't like to use the English word spirit, but so I sometimes use German word Geist because it's a little bit more stretched, right?
Sure.
There's a Geist that merges, and people find it sacred and a source of normative guidance and cultivation of wisdom. And perhaps, and it's deeply intertwined with agape and the way we transcend ourselves through other people when they extend agape to us and we extend agape to them. So, I mean, logos and agape are perhaps deep themes within Christianity, and I do believe that in some important way, um, they were spoken and exemplified by Jesus. I think of him as an enlightened being, an enlightened person, like Siddhartha, like Socrates. Um, and perhaps that's connecting me with some deep themes. And it's having, I mean, and these are the kind of phenomena you can't just know them theoretically. You have to participate in them
Right.
profoundly. And you can only participate in them insofar as you are allowing them to transform you. And so that's why I don't, I want to point people to that, right? And see how it's much more found for me. Um, I mean, so the verse in the Bible, you know, the kingdom of God is within you, is also equally translatable as the kingdom of God is among you, or the kingdom of God is between you, right? And I like to think of that we should be thinking of it that way, and that right that this phenomena I'm pointing to, yes, it's within individuals, but it's as importantly between individuals and among them, pointing them to something beyond themselves. And so I don't like the way this this these media have
Yes.
created the spiritual celebrity and the spiritual superstar. I think I understand why things happen, and I hope I'm not speaking from any resentment towards Jordan Peterson. He is a colleague, and we were always on very good terms. We respect each other. I mean, I have criticisms of him, as I should.
Sure.
I'm sure he has criticisms of me. We've disagreed publicly, and well. I thought our talk was one of the best he had, and I don't think that's arrogance. I just think it is. Yeah.
It's good eating. I mean, like really, it's nourishing. I mean, the conversation that the two of you had. I mean, if you would have thought back several years ago and you'd have said, how many people do you think are going to listen to two University of Toronto professors, not a McLuhan,
Right.
debate meaning in a meaningful way? And the fact that, so I in clinical practice, one of the things that I think that I learned that has helped me in life is that there are strategic moments of disclosure. And I can remember that whenever we had to do process recordings, they were so onerous for me because, you know, you'd have to film the session, which already changes the dynamics of the session.
Of course.
And so I'm working on this notion at the time of getting beyond cultural competence and working on cultural resonance. And I'm saying that in these moments, there's this dance that's going on. As a therapist, sometimes you feel yourself kind of leaning in. Sometimes they tell you something, you're kind of leaning back. And there's this dance happening. And there's also this level of, it's almost like a search function. I don't know another way of describing it other than that, to find out, like, can I match with this person in a way that goes beyond, like, are they good enough to sort of treat me or to offer a modality that might help me in my life? But can they enter my narrative in a way? Can they model me sufficiently? Can they run a simulation of me that's close enough to fidelity that when we're speaking, something's happening, and this happening between us is itself restorative. It's a recapitulation. It's installations of hope. It's all of those things, but it's also creating space. And so whenever I was working on process recordings, it would be sort of in the back of my mind, okay, you're recording this. So the more any of us say in this meeting, that's going to lead to a ton more transcribing, because of the way they made us do it. And my alma mater did a phenomenal job. They had us trained by University of Chicago psychiatrists. One of the coolest things that I've ever done is they brought in a Buddhist monk who also was a mindfulness practitioner. And he trained us on how to practice mindfulness as a practitioner, which sort of aligns and it maps on really well to sort of Carl Rogers' notion of you're just prizing this person, you're not judgmental. When you feel the thing come at you that might let you start to have judgmental thoughts, you hold that and let it go. You know, he really did a great job of teaching us that. And so when I'm in these process recordings, I'm transcribing what the person said, what I said. And then what they had us also do is, what were you thinking? What were you feeling?
Right.
Why did you say what you said when you said it?
Right.
And one of the keys was, were you trying to create a closure because it was getting too uncomfortable for you?
Right.
And so you had to take a moment and get that.
Yeah.
Or were you putting the emphasis on you because, you know, maybe something's going on in your own life where you don't feel that you're getting the attention you need? So in other words, it's trying to teach you to be a good waiter. So a good waiter, I was once told, is someone who every time you look, your cup is filled up.
Yep.
There's always fresh bread on the table, but you never have to say a word to the person. They're just attending, you know, in a way that's not sort of clamorous or too flamboyant. They're there and they're not. And so I think even in teaching students about relational dialectics and how one creates an environment where there's reciprocity, I think that that's one part of it for sure. From my perspective, is that even against, I don't know, maybe everything in you, there have been these moments where you've given these strategic disclosures that sort of brings the other person in, like, okay, like he's got skin in the game now. He's told us something very important about his formative experience. I was raised as a fundamentalist and there was trauma involved in that. Okay, now we're at a different level of knowing, right? I mean, we're not just spouting words off a page. You've got interpersonal skin in the game. And I think you're right that the medium also is, we don't quite know what the internet is doing in terms of recalibrating how we negotiate life, how we instantiate identity. But I do think that that's part of it, is that you've got this icon speaking, right? I mean, you're saying holy words, you know, you're saying these things. And so I do think that there's always within anyone and the potential for transference and counter transference for that matter. But I don't see that in you. And I know you don't want this to be about you, but I'm just trying to tell you, I knew when I said it, I was going to have to like sort of explain that I think that it's like a calling forth. I think it's something that is calling out to, you don't have to be a Christian to say, live up to your own standard, and saying that like in a way that is non-offensive to people. And I think that is the sort of notion that Paul talks about, is like, hey, look, you know, we're preaching the gospel to you, and it's creating this jealousy over here in a good way. It's making them yearn to have this connection with God, because Israel doesn't want to be left out of this. This wasn't just intended for Goyim. This is for the nation of Israel. And so that jealousy, that provocation, I think is part of it. And the carefulness and attentiveness. I mean, I can't, if someone were to count for you, if you paid a grad student to go through your videos where you do like the voice of Vervaeke, count the amount of times where you clarify something. You stop the person and say, not that, but this. Like, it's a very, but it's nuanced. You're doing it in a way that is guiding them closer to truth, right? And I think that resonates with people, even if they don't know why. Just like you can tell when an image when it looks good, like if this camera, there's a better quality camera out there for sure. And you could tell it, even if you didn't know why. Your eye would just sort of pick up on it. It's in you. Right. Like someone trying to find water with a stick, it's just pulling you in that direction. So if you have a homing device and you're out looking for truth, where is it in this sort of polluted information ecology? And someone is speaking the truth to you in love. That's a powerful thing. And so, yeah, I don't hesitate in saying that. And if people have a problem with saying, well, he doesn't profess to be a Christian, what does that matter to me? One of my best friends in undergrad, he was my roommate. He grew up just outside of New Delhi, and he's a Sikh. And he ended up, being befriended by all of these beautiful females in our university's Baptist campus union. And the Baptist campus ministry girls were always asking him to all these events. And so he never had time for us until late in the evening, because he was routinely going out with all of these girls. And so one day he finally comes home and he was like, dang it, man. I said, what? He said, you know what? These girls aren't asking me out because they want to date me. They're asking me out because they want to convert me. Oh. And I said, well, like, what is it that you all talk about? And he said, well, one of the central points is that they keep preaching to me this notion that do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? He was like, yeah, sure. And they're like, do you believe that he's the only Son of God? Yeah, sure. And then they would say, well, so do you consider yourself a Christian? He was like, no, I love all the gods. Like, for him. And they're like, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. See, like, you have to choose. It's either Jesus or right. No one. Like, you can't have it both ways, man. And he was like, no, I can. I really can. And they were like, you can't. And he said, listen, this may be a problem for you, but it's not for me. I respect him as a God. And that so there's something about the duality, non-duality, multiplicity, monotheism, polytheism. He was able, I want to say it like this, because I know him very well. I obviously don't know the interiority of his heart, but I would say, based on knowing him for these many years, there's a way in which his polytheistic view incorporates this. It's a yes and instead of a yes but, and so it's improvisational in that sense. And here's an interesting thing that he did. For him, taking his turban off and cutting his hair was unthinkable. When he moved to the States and he started hanging out with all of these Christians, this notion of Christ dwelling in your heart, that you could be a Christian, that your interior life doesn't necessarily have to match up with this sort of outward sign. And so he did. He cut his hair, took his turban off, and his parents were just like, "Oh my God, what in the world are you doing? We should have never let you go over there. These Westerners are messing you up." And he said, "No, you don't understand." He's like, "I'm a Sikh in my heart. Like, I can't, like, the turban, and it's important to me. Don't get me wrong." But he's like, "I've changed, and now I realize I can be a Sikh in my heart without necessarily having to always wear my turban." And so they told him, "No, you can't." And he was like, "Yes, I can." So he's a bit innovative in that sense. And I think it's similar. And, you know, people who love Lewis have struggled with the fact that they're, I'm not saying he's a universalist, but I'm saying that there are times when he comes very close to saying something similar. It's that the truth that you live up to, that's the standard for you. You can call it the Tao, you can call it, you know, whatever you want, but that's how you're going to be judged, is the standard to which you accept that. You take on that responsibility of saying, this is my standard. And there are characters, even in Narnia, like in the Narnia series, where there's a warrior who's of a different faith, but he lives closer to the standard of Aslan than many of the other Narnians. And so I think that that's sort of it too, right? Is that I think that this was a struggle for Gandhi as well. I mean, you know, look at what he was able to do in a non-violent way. And had it not been for Christians, you know, maybe he would have been one. So that's a lot. I'll stop there for a minute.
No, this is very good. Very good. I've talked to Paul Vanderklee, and he told me that this is a true story of the little girl who came to Lewis and said that she loved Aslan more than Jesus. And Lewis said to her, that was fine. That wasn't a problem. And if you read Lewis carefully, of course, I mean, it's clear that he's a Platonist, even a Neoplatonist through and through.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And so perhaps also my love and deep following of Neoplatonism, of course, I'm trying to, with the help of many other people, bring it into a scientific framework, but my deep love and life within Neoplatonism might also be something that resonates with Christians. I know it does with J.P. Marceau, for example, and perhaps with people who, like with Paul, who love Lewis, perhaps because that's another place.
It's definitely there. It's definitely there. And I would say from like a sort of Phaedrus take on things, yeah, maybe it's that maybe you have the philosophical soul, and somehow you've gotten these glimpses of the noumenal world, you know, and it's just, this is this goes so much deeper than I think we give it credit for, this notion of falling, the soul falling. in one criticism that I read years ago in classical rhetoric is talking about that Plato is doing something unique here in this scenario, because beyond the Orphic or any of the existing notions of what the soul was like, he's bringing in this one horse, that's an evil horse, that's just sort of fighting, a dark horse that's fighting against you, so that the soul is not entirely pure in and of itself, which, it's sort of recalcitrant. And just as you can poke your head above the heavens and
Yeah.
Toan is right there, you're like, this is it, this is true being, this is the essence of everything, and then boom, you fall. And this notion of falling and remembering,
Yeah.
and this is, I think, also part of it, right, is that what you're doing as you're bumping up against us is you're helping us remember our faith. Like, it's putting it back together. And
that would please me greatly. I'm not anti-theist. I'm a non-theist, but I'm not anti-theist, right? And I've said this before, and I've said it publicly, and I'll say it again now. If that happens for people, and they are able to return to Christianity in a way that reaches from the depths of their psyche to the depths of reality, so that they can more reliably cultivate wisdom, then great. Like, that's amazing, right? That, I mean, I uh, I don't I don't want anything other than to afford people to be able to find authentic paths for the authentic aspirational paths for the cultivation of wisdom and meaning in life. That is what I want.
right.
And um, so this, and I'm happy to disagree with people. You said bumping up against. If we all are engaged in a shared philia, right, of the logos, if we all get to a place in the discussion where we couldn't get on our own, then dialogos has occurred, right? And as long as people come to that in good faith, and they're open to the logos in that fashion, then again, great. That's that I want to affirm that. That's what I want to do. And I also hope that there's no duplicity in me when I can honestly recognize, I try to do this, like very good arguments, very good unfolding of thought in other people whose position I don't necessarily agree with. Like, I just did that recently. JP has released a video about miracles, and and there's this constant dialogue between him and I and Paul about this, and Lewis is in the background, and I thought it was brilliant. I don't agree with it all the way,
For sure. Yeah.
but if you'd allow me to speak somewhat poetically, but not, that doesn't mean trivially, I see the light in what's happening, right? And that if we remember, that's originally what saying something was brilliant meant. There's a light in it, right? There's a shining forth. There's an emergence of intelligibility. There's an opening of the field of human experience that other people can participate in. Where I see that happening, that for me is the sacred. And that's what I love. And that's what I'm called to. And if I can help other people return to that fount, then that gives my life tremendous meaning. I'm not doing it for that purpose. I find it meaningful precisely because I think it's a good thing when that happens.
And I think that that's why it's so powerful, right? Is that that's not what you set out to do. And I recall your, like, I think the third in the series with Jordan Hall, this notion of a font, like
Yes. Yeah.
that came up. And look, I think we have, I have to is a bad way of phrasing this, but what I want to say is maybe it's time for people like myself. Like I have to give, this is the thing is now that I have a child,
Ah, that changes
yeah,
people in a way nothing else does. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but like that just makes
no,
me
no,
understand things that I
it's,
couldn't understand, right? I get you in a way that I didn't get a minute ago, right? Yeah.
ugh. So I told my wife, this is such an innocuous moment, right? I mean, it was
Yeah.
just in the act of play. She's two now, and so
Uh,
she's motoring around, but this has been such a weird time,
yeah.
lockdown. You know, she went into lockdown this time, you know, a couple weeks ago, last year.
Of
You
course.
know, the daycare's shut down, and home
Oh,
she goes with us, and we were sent into quarantine. Our jobs with the government, they sent us home, and the universities where I was taking a I was going to take a position at a university that, believe it or not, it's a very prestigious liberal arts school, but they refused to do online learning. They felt like it diminished the sort of educational
mm,
package they were putting out, because for them, part of the formation process was about being on campus, going through the great book series with your cohort, so
right.
that
Right.
as you progress, you know, as you start stacking things, whatever your subject matter is, you all have this kind of foundation throughout your time together. And so it just got very awkward, very weird, because none of us knew. It was like an ellipsis, a dot, dot, dot. What do we do? Um, we're going to do 2 weeks, and it's going to potentially look. My area is communication and bioethics. So, you know, I knew this was not going to slow down after 2 weeks.
Right.
And the deranged nature um, in the US, you just sort of see wherever those fault lines were, it just intensified and made
Yeah.
everything
Yeah.
worse.
Yeah.
Because people, we're such social creatures. You know, we I just told my wife this. I said, I don't know why people have a problem with this notion that we are still animals, right? I mean, we are animals that aspire to be angels, but there's an animality
Yeah.
to us.
I like
There's
that.
We are embodied creatures. There are things that we need from our environment. One of them is contact. We need to see a certain amount of faces, and we can get to the sort of Dunbar's number
Yeah.
portion, but just even at a physiological level, the studies that were done on the nuns who donated their brains for Alzheimer's research, it's just fascinating that they found the same amount of plaque in the brains of some of these nuns that you would find in someone who had full-blown Alzheimer's, and yet they didn't have symptoms.
Yeah.
And so they were saying
Tremendous
there's a
cognitive reserve.
something,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's this protective factor. This, our sociality is a kind of
Yeah.
protective factor. And I don't, you know, I don't know if there's more of us being projected into our sort of discursive identity,
Mhm.
and not very thin portion of us exists in a sort of material, concrete
Yeah.
place. And so I don't know, as we make more and more deposits there, what that means in terms of I think we're making the same mistake as we did when we rapidly industrialized. Only this time that colonialization is happening internally. We're now deepening that. We're incorporating technologies into ourselves, extending our consciousness in ways that were just unfathomable just a few decades ago. To have a sort of
Yeah.
supercomputer
Yeah.
at your disposal, it does make me think of Socrates asking, is this technology a good thing?
Right.
Is literacy a good thing? Because
Right.
remember what he says there is they'll have the illusion of knowing things, but they won't have wisdom. And part of the reason for that is because if you get rid of the dialectic,
Yeah.
then I can't sharpen you. You can't sharpen me. In an online environment, we can throw stones at one another, but there's something about this that even disagreeing, which is where I started off with this, is that I've finally had to accept for myself that now that we have a baby and one who's grown up in one of the most bizarre set of circumstances that
Right.
I can
Right.
imagine,
Yeah.
I have her to answer to in a way. Like
Yeah.
what am I doing today to make the world a place that's habitable for her? And
Yes.
as it relates to this conversation that you were having with Jordan Hall, I mean, you guys are going back and forth around, you're circling around this motif of the parent and the child. And of
Hmm.
course, it hit me very close to home because our daughter's name is Mary Claire. She was running through the house and she slipped. And I saw it out of the corner of my eye. We still don't know. She just slipped on something. And when she fell in such a way that she just let out this moaning. It wasn't like a shrill cry like she normally did. It was like, I knew it hurt. I
Wow.
immediately knew it hurt. She just went like, oh, and when that happened, it felt like my heart
Wow.
stopped.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I
And
know.
after it was over, when she knew she was okay, and we knew she was okay, I looked at my wife and I said, the only way you could prevent that is to just chain her up.
Yeah.
I mean, she's already in a bubble
Yep. Yep.
and she has to explore her environment. She has to move about. She has to
That's
learn to
huge.
fall
Yeah.
and get back up. And so I know that at the core of many issues with religion in general is this notion of theodicy, and how do we account for that, and where comes this evil in this world?
Mm.
Is it it's not a very good God, if this is as good as God can do, or is it something defective in us?
Right.
There's Enochian interpretations. Is there, there's a Genesis 3,
Yeah.
but then there's a Genesis 6, and then there's uh, uh, potentially some sin of the Watchers, that sort of Promethean scenario gone wrong, where they sort of tell human beings about the best ways to sort of destroy themselves, how to increase their depravity as quickly as possible and scale it up. So something like
Mm.
Babel. And so I don't know where I fall on any of that, other than to say that as soon as I became a parent, I knew that I would never, my happiness, the ceiling on my happiness had gone up,
Hmm.
but the floor of my suffering had also gone down,
Totally.
because I'm never going to be happier than I am when she's well
Yeah.
and taken care of and safe. And so that's suddenly out of my control. As long as she was in my wife's womb, didn't worry so much. But
Yeah. Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
because this is something you said, is like, to live in this world means you have to act. And it's one of the first things I found myself saying to her is, I'm holding this little creature in my arms, this little 7-pound baby, and she was born a little premature.
Wow.
And so she was having a little bit of trouble negotiating how to eat. And so I remember just sitting there holding this little itty bitty bottle, and I'm trying to get her to take it. And I'm saying, hey, listen, you, at this point, you have to do the
Yeah.
work. We can't
Yeah.
do it for you. Like, I'm going to hold this bottle. And of course, cognitively, does a baby cognitively understand that? Probably depends on what you mean. If you mean like embodied cognition, are they
Yeah.
taking in and receiving what you're saying? If there's
I
emotional
think
cues in it.
there's biological cognitive machinery in children that it's responsive to the affordance of agency. There's that. We have. I mean, we've gone through several species across millions of years where becoming a reflective cognitive agent has obviously been selected for. And so I take it there's a receptivity in us for agency, like there's a receptivity for us in language. Does your daughter know or understand the language you're speaking? No, but does speaking to her actually make her capable of understanding a language? Exactly. And I think it's the same sort of responsiveness. Uh, I hope that makes sense.
No, it does, because this was astounding. I mean, it had been in the room, I believe the case, but when they came in to do testing with her, they hooked her up to these biofeedback machines, and they've got
Yeah.
different points all over her body where they attach the feedback. And so the only way they could get her to do it was if my wife was holding her.
Right.
And the problem was, it's like, when the testing began, they were like, oh, we're gonna have to do this over. We're gonna have to do it over. So they start doing it over. And I'm kind of sitting in the corner, just kind of watching what's happening here.
Yeah.
What's going on? Everything's new. And so there's only a few things that can go right, in life,
Yeah.
but only one thing has to go wrong for it to be game over. And so
Right.
I'm like, what, is this bad? What's happening? And the physician looked at us and she said, look, this happens sometimes, but the baby is actually like, that she and her mom are so closely connected right now that we're getting feedback from the mom, like through
Right.
her.
Right. Right.
It's
Right.
skewing the test.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And so I thought that was profound, that it's like,
Yeah.
we're starting to get to the point where we can measure some of this. Just like I said, I think there will be a point in time in which we'll be able to, if not quite quantify what's going on, even in a therapeutic relationship that makes it flourish, that you could start to match people in a way that you
Sure.
probably couldn't before. But the point of that was just to say to her, listen, if you want to live here, you have to do this,
Right.
because this is not a place where it's going to take it easy on you. Like,
No.
you're going to have to fight for the things that you need as an organism in order to survive. And this is this harsh reality. And I actually share some of the dynamics that you spoke of in terms of your faith experience growing up, the religious upbringing, except for the fundamentalists that I was part of was this sort of radical love. But let me put a twist on it for you, because I think of all people, you might find this humorous. So where I'm originally from, it's in the absolute backwoods, nowhere, more cows than people. Probably one of the only academics that you will know that before going to school in the mornings fed hogs, like that,
Yeah.
you know, livestock and things like that. That's how you made your living. And my father, his family, that he has 7 brothers,
Wow.
they were so poor that was one of the ways that they survived. Was the brothers were farmed out during the summers. They were basically sold to the highest bidder to do work, to pick cotton, to pick, you know, watermelons and things like this. And my uncles told me, you know, there were nights that they would go to bed and their arms would be locked at like 90 degrees because they had been throwing watermelons for so long.
Right.
And so my grandparents didn't have electricity. They didn't have running water. They didn't have any of these sort of amenities in life. But one thing that they did was they valued education and knowledge, even though they didn't have it themselves.
Mhm.
They
Yeah.
just sort of knew that if you could get more of this thing, if you had access to it and you took advantage of it, it could take you places. So every week after service was over, my grandfather would pull my brothers and I aside. He'd say, like, how are your studies? How are your studies going? This man didn't even have a high school education, you know, but he knew that it was
Right.
important. And this kind of oral society that I grew up in, it's largely unchanged. I mean, it's very much like if I won a Nobel Prize and I go home, that's not, nobody gives, not two cares about that. They're just gonna be like, hey baby, how you doing? Like
Yeah.
it's about hospitality, right? That's the language they speak. And this is where the sort of careful approach and having a careful interlocutor is crucial for me, because I'm not quite sure what it is people are meaning whenever they point to the growth, the explosion of Christianity in, say, sub-Saharan Africa.
Mhm.
You know, in 1900, there's like less than 10 million like confessing Christians, and now we're like 500 million. And the models, if they hold up, because of, if for no other reason, just the rate of population growth, they're going to be over like 1.3 billion Christians. So you're sort of like Europe, North America, like all of that has just gotten turned upside down, right? Like the center of faith is not Rome really anymore. It's not Prague. It's not London. It's not, definitely not New York or LA. You're talking about places like Nigeria.
Right.
And so one of the questions that I have is, what is it that we're saying when we say that while faith is receding in the West, it's accelerating in these other places. I want to be careful about, because for me, I can, there's a part of me that understands the negative aspect of the argument, which is to say, following Hume, that yes, superstitious people, whenever they get more education, when they get more developed, you can sort of disabuse them of this notion of any sort of supernatural. And he's probably, the philosopher who gives us this precursor to the God in the gaps argument, that
Sure.
it's going to keep closing as people are better educated and we weed out superstition. So for my own part, I know that I like to say that hillbillies, they speak with an accent, but that doesn't mean they think with an accent. And so what is it? Because I know that there's this association in the States between the sort of Bible Belt. Some of the negative things that you could say are just, they're true. And how these two paradoxes, they stand side by side, that you could have places that maybe there's potentially more racism, but then higher levels of professed faith. But this notion that they're just like sort of gun-toting, Bible-thumping, whatever that means, I don't know, bigots, I think that that's sort of like, in a way, isomorph to the kinds of arguments that are being made about where faith is also sprouting up. This is, the darkest Africa trope that's just unbelievably pathetic. And I want to make sure that people know that when I'm talking about faith, I'm also talking about a kind of philosophy of mind, wherein you take that child from Nigeria and you import them here where I live. That child will do everything that my daughter does right now. There's no cognitive difference here, right? I mean, you take her and she's raised in Kenya, she's going to be a Kenyan, right? So I want to disabuse this notion that there's something unique about the position that Westerners are in that's associated with a kind of like cognitive complexity. We're up here, we're industrialized, and as other places industrialize, they too will lose their faith. Because that would think about this, that's a sort of falsifiable claim, and I want to run this by you. There's an anthropologist, Edward Schieffelin. If you're not familiar with his work, he's an amazing guy, very, very cordial. I've had interaction with him just corresponding via email, and I came across this tidbit, and I couldn't believe it was true. So I had to go straight to the source and find out. He lived with the Bosavi for 2 decades. And I mean, just copious amounts of field work, knew thousands of people. And in one of his publications on their sort of disposition, he couldn't find, according to any Western standard, not one case of depression. And I was stunned by this. I was like, wait, what do you mean? Because I'm sort of building here. I'm saying, I know what my father's life was like. And it was hard. It was brutal and hard. And his father's was worse. But I can also sort of trace with that in the life that I live. It's like, well, my life is better than my father's. And I'm not as resilient as him. Like, I'm not. I'm not as hardy as him. And I mean that in every way that you could mean that. And so when um, Dr. Schiffelin said that it's important to know this about them, they have never lived an Arcadian life, not ever. It is hard. It is spectacularly hard. There is war, there is violence, and there is illness and death and suffering that to a Westerner is unimaginable. And you look at it and you say, how is this person not depressed? Because in my doctoral program, I got sort of lured away by this government project on cultural competence, cultural and linguistic competence in behavioral health. And there was this federal grant that allowed us to try to reach unserved populations. And as that grant was cycling down, I authored this other federal grant to follow up on it, to reach these rural areas that they just had no treatment options. You know, when I was writing it, one of the reasons why it was funded at like $12 million, which is just a drop in the bucket to the billions that we spend annually, is, get this now, state of Florida where I live, it is going back and forth with New York as second or third largest state in the union. There's roughly 22 to 24 million people here. And if you were to take children and youth with a serious emotional disturbance, a clinically diagnosed behavioral health issue, they would make up the third largest demographic in the third largest state. This to me was just like, I couldn't believe it, that youth committing suicide at such a high rate, that young people are having such a difficult time living. That's not to say that adults aren't either, but I'm just saying, what is it like? The society is trying to tell you something, and these children are sort of crying out as exemplars that we have not created an environment that's hospitable to life. And you know, of all the epidemiological work that's been done, no one can point to, it's multivariate for sure.
Of course.
No one has a good explanation for the phenomenon and why it's scaling so fast. So when I was sitting in those meetings about whether or not this money is going to get appropriated, I'm way over my head at this point. I shouldn't be in these rooms having these conversations, right? And they sort of look at me and they're like, all right, what's, bottom line, give it to me. I said, bottom line? Okay. This is circa 2007. And wouldn't you like to know that the market is going to crash? Because what I'm telling you is all of our models are broken on the way that we have conceptualized healthcare.
Yeah.
We're hoping to divert money that we're spending on the highest utilizers and use that as like capturing them younger and earlier so that they don't escalate to like a full-blown, say, like psychosis or something like that. If we can intervene earlier, maybe we can prevent that.
Right.
I said, this is 2007. It's going to crash, because what you all are telling me is something like, this kid went out in the street, he got shot, and he got shot in a particular area of his abdomen that's almost always fatal. And so what we need is the best surgeon in the world to come in and save his life. And guess what? We made that happen. An N of 1, we saved his life. But then he went back into his environment and he got shot again. And not only him, but his friend. And so now you need 2 surgeons, or you need this one to be a miracle worker and be able to perform 2 surgeries at once. I said, so our problem, if you can follow me here, our problem is not that we need better surgeons. We just need kids to stop getting shot. Like that's, that sounds like it should be prima facie, like obviously this is the problem, but it isn't. I mean, it isn't clear to people like what the problem is, what is causing such a dramatic, and I can't imagine right now what the numbers look like, what they will look like after this past year.
They'll be bad. The numbers will be bad.
They're going to be atrocious in every way. So I think that we're going to be in the wake of that for quite some time.
I agree.
And so that's why I think that these conversations they're not just, I don't want to do this. Like, you know what I mean? I want to stay in my office with my books. I want to go to the university. I want to teach some students, have office hours, come home, see my wife. Like, I'm not a public person. You know, I know that may sound strange to some people. They're like, well, you instruct people. And this is what I would tell people that always ask me about that. Because at our university, when you're teaching theory classes, you're teaching to, you know, at least a couple hundred.
Right.
In large lecture halls. Like, yeah, but that was part of my contract. Like, I was contractually obligated to do it and didn't know I would fall in love with it, but I did. And so this is deeply uncomfortable for me because I don't want to do this. But at the same time, like I always feel like I'm compelled to do something. Mm-hmm. And even though I may not be getting it right, I'm at least starting, and I'm certainly going to miss. And the key is just, as I'm babbling my way through this, like our daughter did, like that I'm at least getting closer to the right word, you know? Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's seeing you struggle to put something of yourself out there has helped people like me say, man, why you got to get off the fence at some point. I mean, you got to have some skin in the game, because if we do nothing, this crisis it's not going to just mysteriously get better. It's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yes.
And I fear it's going to get much, much worse.
Yes.
And your astute assessment. And I know that, like, for authors, once you write a book and you move on to the next project, it's like, I want to focus on this project that I'm on right now. But for those of us who are in the audience, who are readers, your zombies in Western culture, like, it still has so much currency, because I look at what's happening around me, and I'm like, this doesn't even seem possible, does it? That for Christmas and for Lent, I had like a diet that I followed, but then I had an informational diet, and I just said, I'm just fasting news.
Yeah.
But even though I was doing that, like, there were so many interruptions of this shooting happened, this calamity happened, this coup happened. I mean, like, you know, my friends just would text me and say, what's happening in such and such place? And I have no idea what is happening. And I felt, I almost felt bad about that, which also speaks to this kind of the medium, right? That like in this world, everyone belongs to everybody. Like your life is not your own in that sense, that like if you're not following the news, then the news is also happening to you, whether you're reading it or not, or you're following it or not, because the sort of dominant mode of our communication, people texting, sending you clips of things. So even if you're trying to avoid like watching that on TV, it's still interrupting your life, because it's just sort of it has so much purchase on us. And so, man, this is why like I was afraid that if I had a conversation with you, I would not take the advice of my mentors when I lived in England. Like when I was at Oxford, they would say to the Americans, or they call us Yanks, don't try to do all of Europe at once, like go to a few countries, come back. Like you can always come back, right? Don't try to do too much at once. And so I'm sacrificing a lot of depth for trying to throw out as many things as possible, just to gauge and at least set the table for what I would hope at some point in the future could be a dialogue that's better formulated on my part, for sure.
Well, I mean, I appreciate everything you said. I don't think it was shallow at all. I think you're presenting a very stark realization of the profundity of the meaning crisis, and the fact that we're realizing that we've been sort of told these things, X, Y, and Z, will lead to the good life. And we're getting more and more evidence, and you just pointed to another batch of evidence, that's simply not true. That's simply not true. And it's unclear what that's going to mean. Obviously, it's going to mean a lot for political institutions that are progressively just getting unglued from what's happening in the culture, right, in profound ways.
Why the West is having a kind of ontological shock that leaves them sort of receding from faith in the Christian God, where they might be developing new sort of nascent faiths that are popping up. And the worldview, the sort of Christian worldview breaking down. I mean, you guys did such a great job of wording that, this sort of sacred canopy that as long as you're underneath this, everything makes sense. But this meta narrative, as it starts to break down, I'm not sure why that's happening in the West and not, say, Africa.
I don't want to sound overly Hegelian, but culture isn't separate from history, and culture and history aren't separate from technology. They're actually overlapping, interpenetrating things. I mean, Erstadt's thing about the real reason why we stopped believing in God is because we went through a historical political development and an economic development, the invention of the chimney, for example, that allows us to live atomic lives, and that there's a direct correlation between people who live as individuals and people who largely have a sort of secular attitude towards the world. And you find, and so one of her biggest arguments is that's her data, right? And what I sort of hear her saying in that, I don't know if she directly said it, so I don't want to over attribute, but what you could derive from what she said, that I think that's fair, is when we lose extended families and we lose the intergenerational transmission of knowledge. This is something that Zach Stein has pointed out. Our educational, if you look everywhere else about all of the cultures, education is designed to be an intergenerational thing. We've removed that. We don't try to stitch the generations together the way your grandfather did with you in his seeking for knowledge. We now orient education not back to the previous generations and forward to the current one. We orient it to the market. We orient it to the market, and the market is here now, bottom line, fast turnover, right? There's that. Also, when you don't live in extended families, the number of perspectives you internalize is radically diminished. And
Yes.
so you are then more likely to, you tend towards a narcissistic egocentrism, right? And you tend to get locked into the kind of existential modes that are conducive to anxiety and depression. These are all correlated together, right? And so I don't think, I mean, I think that I think that it's almost crypto racist argument that, you know, the silly savages with their superstition, which I think is a disgusting thing behind it. But I also disagree with the opposite one. Well, they're that way because of our colonialism. I think Isaac is right. That's just masked racism. We're still the center, but instead of being the good center in imperialism, we're the bad center of everything in colonialism. That's also just so patronizing, right? No, let's say, well, like, no, something that doesn't go in either of those horrible directions is an argument I'm trying to present to you, which is like, no, we have a particular history, and that history has put us into a particular kinds of a particular place. I tried to trace that history out in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, but the way it has fractured, like the communing between people, between generations, the communing between people of, like, in extended families, so that you see that they do not have people like we do not have, they do have resources. They have internalized cognitive stances, existential modes that give them greater, and I mean in both a quantitative and qualitative sense, greater access to the power of distributed cognition and the collective intelligence. And I mean that both synchronically and diachronically. And they can tap into this in a powerful way that gives people tremendous resources for overcoming, you know, self-deception, for, I mean, you think of the, I got to work with Igor Grossman, a whole bunch of other people, and we published a paper, you know, in 2019 in Psychological Inquiry, a consensus of all the people doing work on wisdom. And this meta-perspectival ability is one of the key pieces that everybody's converging on. That's one of the central features of wisdom. So much so, Igor Grossman, he has the, like, and this goes back to Baltes and Staudinger. Get somebody, this is really interesting. Get somebody and they're trying to work on a hard problem, interpersonal problem. They'll inevitably default to the egocentric I, blah, 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 and they describe it, right? And you say, okay, now stop, and then just do this one modification. I want you to re-describe the same problem as if somebody else was describing it from the third person perspective. It's called the Solomon effect, because people get insight into their problem just by doing that. Now, if you've internalized, right, and you have to do it at an attachment level, like in family and close friends, if you've internalized multiple others, right, you've got that resource available to you. Now, here's an interesting twist on it, though, which I find really, and this goes back to Baltes, but there's more recent work on this. You get the effect, and I hope this, well, let me try it. You get the same effect when people are trying to solve, if they not only talk to another person, but like in Grossman, they just imagine talking to another person, or imagine. There's an imaginal, not an imaginary, there's an imaginal move that allows people to augment their insight into patterns in reality that they're otherwise blind to, right? And so you can think of this imaginal augmentation of insight into reality. And I don't mean this insultingly. I think this is one of the primary functions that religion performs, right? that
Right.
it gives
Yeah.
people, right? It gives people, right? It gives people, if you'll allow me to stretch the metaphor, it gives them an imaginal extended family and an imaginal cross-generational thing by which they can tap into tremendous resources to bring to bear on the complex, ill-defined, and prone to self-deception problems that beset human beings. And when you lose that resource and you confront the shitty messiness of life all the time, and you're largely inept in the face of it, you're going to fall into anxiety and depression.
I think you're right, because one of the things that I can say about coming from this place where, like, this deep South
Mm,
hospitality centered, the kind of laverie, that, like, a dwelling place, you weary traveler, come here. Like, whenever you come home from college or university, you're always too thin, you haven't eaten enough, everywhere you go, people, oh my, a vegan, what in the world is that? Like, sure. I'm just saying, like, there is this sort of sample size that, even though it's a smaller
yeah,
community, it's not New York, you're sampling all of those personalities up close and personal, because to live in that society is to have extended brothers and sisters, which is why, at my age, there are there are more people that I have known that have died than there are people that I know remaining. I at least have some verses that say to me, and it is comforting to say, like, you're surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses.
mhm,
And what are they doing? They're just cheering you on. They're saying, you can do it, you can make it, you can. And when my grandmother died, um, a few years ago, again, there are benefits of burdens in living in a place like that, where they send her home to die, and it's like, well, they're gonna call in hospice. In my mind, I was thinking, okay, these healthcare workers are gonna come in and they're gonna take care of her and help her through this process. No, man, this nurse walks in, hooks her up to an IV, and says, like, here's this button, and it's connected to morphine, and you
yeah,
press it,
yeah,
and then it's connected to a timer, and as soon as it goes off, you press it again, and you just keep doing it until she slips away. And so, remarkably, this almost 90-year-old woman, she's not allowed food or drink or anything, and she lasts 7 days like that, with just, it's it's almost like, by fasting, like, I don't know if she went into some, like, state of ketosis or something, and it made her even more resilient,
right.
because she was without medications that she typically would have needed on an ordinary day to just survive. But here she is, and she's fully conscious. And this was what was so peculiar to me, is that when you talk about propositional, perspectival, participatory, all of that, like, the the notion that, like, I will one day die, I don't care how many times you say that to yourself. And philosophy being the, at least one take on it is you, you're learning what the good life is, so you can learn how to die well. You're always sort of on your way to to study death, study dying. This is at least one of Socrates' gifts to us. But seeing someone who's so fully conscious and cogent beyond my level of expectation, it was so disarming. And here's where I wanted to tie it in with the death of God, because Nietzsche's right in that when my grandmother was dying, we had to participate in it. We
Yeah.
had to take, no one did it for us.
I
We
was there,
had to take
similar
it
with my mom's death. Same thing.
and press the button and watch her sort of fade.
Yes.
And then she would sort of come out of it. And right as she was coming out of it, it hit her again. And it was traumatizing. I mean, I can honestly say that was, for me, because it almost felt like that we were the ones taking part in killing her. And I know that it's not quite right. We're help ease her suffering. I get it. But I'm saying this very act of like, I'm putting the thing in her body that's causing her lungs not to be able to function anymore. And I know that it's going to result in her death. And that reality that the madman says, like, you know, who's worthy of such a thing? Like, God's dead, and he's not just dead, we killed him. Like, we took part in this thing. We did it. And in order to be worthy of that, what do you have to be? Maybe you have to be a God. And I think in my email to you, I said, you know, one of the problems that I see is the phenomenology of dreaming. I think Bachelard says it's like, you don't dream that you're flying. In your dream, you are flying. And so you're experiencing the thing in your dream. And my mentor in undergrad, he said that he's a phenomenologist, a brilliant guy, wrote this amazing book on embodied communication. He said he used to have these terrible nightmares until, like, he saw a therapist. His therapist says to him, he's like, you know what is it that's causing you to have nightmares? He's like, I don't know. I just wake up every night having nightmares, and they're always different. And, you know, Chesterton said, well, we have nightmares to try to wake ourselves from the sleep that we're in. And so he said that one of the things they told him to do was practice openness, mindfulness. So before you go to bed, lay there for 10 minutes and just relax into it and say, I'm just open. Whatever comes to me in my dream, I'm open to it.
Yes.
And so he said, you know, it's been 30 years since I've had a nightmare, because it doesn't matter what comes up. I'm open to it. And my concern is that we're not open to the dreams that we're dreaming, which is why we're manifesting things like a zombie as a kind of representative anecdote or metaphor for where we're at. Just mindless, but feeding on information, feeding on a brain. It feels like one of the dreams that we're dreaming is, okay, we'll take Nietzsche at his word. And if you read Kurzweil, when he says God doesn't exist yet, he puts a yet on it, because, you know, he wants to make something very much like a God, you know, as close to that as you can get, as close to being able to bring back your loved ones as is possible, as close to living a kind of immaterial life, a life where your mind is instantiated into a machine. So I wonder if that's the way that we're working around, rather than grieving the death of this sort of mechanical view of the universe, a deistic God, a Newtonian God, if we just sort of skipped it and said, screw that, we'll build our own, we'll make our own. Like all of that before was myth, but now we have the technical capacity to create something like an AI that potentially could be a super intelligent machine, and for all intents and purposes, from our perspective, be a god.
Well, I want to reply to that with a critique of Kurzweil that I think will actually let me circle back to a more profound answer to Nietzsche and to what you've brought up. I gave a talk on at the Center for Ethics on AI and ethics, so you'd be very interested in this topic.
Yeah.
And I was basically arguing most of the concern with the ethics around AI is like, well, we have to treat them as people, where we give them rights, or should we make these machines because they might supplant us and things like that. And I said there's an ethical issue that's not actually being faced. And it points towards kind of a blind spot in our culture. So speaking as a cognitive scientist and a cognitive psychologist, there's really good evidence that intelligence is a necessary but insufficient condition for rationality, where rationality doesn't mean logicality. It means the ability to detect reliably, systematically detect patterns of self-deception and bias, and reliably and systematically and systemically address them. We know this. We've got really good evidence. It's some of the most robust evidence in all of cognitive psychology. It doesn't suffer from replication crisis. So as we're trying to make more and more genuine, what's called artificial general intelligence, AGI, we're turning more and more to machines, not because we're mimicking human biology, but because just a sort of functional design necessity that are multi-machines. They're combinations of neural networks and standard computational. They're much more self-organizing and dynamic. You don't program a neural network, for example. You don't program it, right? Okay, so what's happening is we're making these things multi-machines that embody and implement massively complex self-organizing dynamical systems at many levels, like us. Which means, like us, and because of the very same reason, those machines are going to be, as we make them more intelligent, they're going to be more and more beset by self-deceptive behavior, self-destructive, self-deceptive behavior. This is what Kurzweil doesn't see. So we should not be thinking about just artificial intelligence. We should be thinking about artificial rationality. And not only that, if you take, and I'm not going to review the arguments, but if you take my argument that there's multiple ways of knowing, well, there's multiple ways of rationality, because there's, the ways in which the various kinds of knowing interfere with each other in complex ways. And so you don't just need one set of strategies to be rational. You need a bunch of strategies that have complementary strengths and weaknesses. You need an ecology of rationalities. And so you get this sort of rationally self-transcending rationality that's always recreating itself and redesigning itself. And I think that's what wisdom is. I think ultimately we have to be making these creatures, because we're creating them, we have to be affording them wisdom. But here's the problem we face. We've got very good templates of intelligence, us. We don't have very good templates of rationality, and we have pitifully few templates of wisdom. So here's the argument. There's a moral obligation on us, if we're going to pursue transhumanism, to become as wise as we possibly can. But then we realize, but that was always the moral obligation. And that was always the way of theosis. That was always the way of becoming a being worthy of the kairoses of history, right? And so I think the transhumanists are making a mistake that our culture keeps making. We talked about it earlier. They confuse sort of technological economic issues we talked about it earlier. People have confused the fact that we don't economically need each other, and therefore we can live alone, with the fact that we psycho-ontologically need each other. Man does not live by bread alone, right? By every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, right? We need the logos. That's what I'm trying to do with my project of dialectic into dialogos. It's give people No, communing in intimacy, not only with each other, but with the logos, and through the logos, with the intelligibility that connects you with the depths of reality, that feeds you, that nourishes you in a way that all of the economics of our system leaves you starving for. And if people cultivate the wisdom, then they have what we've perennially always thought was the answer to the issue of how are we worthy of kairos. We're worthy of kairos when we can say we are in theosis. That is when we are worthy of it. I mean, I thought that, and I don't mean any disrespect for this, but I thought this was, I mean, because I don't think of it as exclusive. That's why I don't mean to be disrespect. But one of the messages of Christianity, right, is, no, you have, right, the kairos and the incarnation are paired events. They go together, right? In order to deal with the kairos, the sacred, the divine, and the human have to be brought into a more appropriate relationship, a more appropriate, and a new one, right? There has to be a re-understanding of it. And so I think what we need, and whether or not Jonathan Pageau was right and Christianity is dying and going through resurrection, or whether I fear that it's not, I fear like other religions, it might be dying. And I don't mean any offense by that. I mean, but I've heard no reason as to, other than just sort of triumphal exceptionalism. It's like, well, why is this religion going to be any different from other religions, and so, but whether or not, so I'm putting that debate aside. That's what I'm saying. I'm just going to bracket it, okay? Because I don't think it's germane to what I want to say, which is whether or not it's a resurrection of Christianity or something post-Christian, I don't know. I don't have a full closure argument. I have my suspicions. I will speak them publicly and I will speak with integrity, but I don't claim to have more closure, and I'm clear on that. Okay, right. So putting that aside, but what these two options will share, right, is they will share a re-inventio of what wisdom and theosis mean for us so that we can be appropriate to the kairos. And placing our hopes in sort of hybridizing ourselves with artificial intelligence, I think is to miss, I mean, first of all, once you understand what that project is going to really entail, it's to put us back into the project we should be engaging in the first place. See, I'm actually very, very interested right now in this psycho-ontological nourishment. And we should remember that the word understand is actually, although it's a good metaphor because profound and substance, the original Germanic word is unterstand. We're between each other. It's dialogical, right? It's inherently dialogical. And I'm really interested in, and we're going to talk about this in the current series I'm doing with Greg and with Greg Enriquez and Christopher Mastropietro, the elusive I, the nature and function of the self. I'm interested in the soulful dimension of the self. I'm interested in that part of the self that gets nourishment, psycho-ontological nourishment from intimacy with the logos, intimacy with this, and really profoundly understanding that, and how that nourishment is a nurturing, it's a naturing, it strengthens us. I'm really interested in, the stuff, the emergence, well, you'd know it better than I. We were talking about external family systems theory, but internal family systems theory is taking off, right? Yeah. And people are figuring out there's a resonance, and it goes back to Neoplatonism. Plato talked about, you get the harmony within and the harmony without, and then they resonate with each other. And people are rediscovering this anagoge, and how psycho-ontologically nourishing it is. And this soulful dimension of the self, this is, I think, where I would put my hopes, rather than in sort of the techno promise. By the way, I just think there are great cognitive science reasons why Kurzweil's project is also doomed, but I'll put that aside for other reasons. I think he has a computational theory of mind, which is largely being falsified as cognitive science, or at least disconfirmed as cognitive science progresses and as artificial intelligence progresses. So all that being said, I think my hope, my faith is, and that's why I'm putting so much effort into this project, is that can we get practices of dialectic that afford, because we can't do dialogos. People say, well, that's not proper. We participate in it. We can do dialectic, and that can set the stage in which logos can emerge for itself, right?
Right.
And right, and, you know, when two or three are gathered in my name, right? That kind of
Exactly.
thing. And so, and again, I don't mean that disrespectfully, right?
No,
And
no.
so, right, I think I put my hope in, can we figure out, can we talk to the long-standing ancient tradition of dialectic, both within the Socratic, Platonic, and within the Christian tradition, and can we put that into dialogue, theoretical and practical, with these emerging communities of discourse, so that we can resurrect, but better, re-inventio, because inventio means to discover and to make. Re-inventio, dialectic into dialogos, so we can start feeding people in this way that your extended family back home still has, in powerful ways. That's where I'm putting my hope and my energy. If you want to call that my faith, that's where I'm putting it.
Well, I will say that I was in the field with my dad, and he was planting, and I was walking behind the tractor, and I was making sure that the seeds went into the ground and were covered the way they're supposed to. And when it was time to harvest, my wife's from a very large city, and so one of her first experiences doing that, it's like, oh, there's bugs. Oh, there's snakes.
Good.
Like, yes, like it's all of the above. That's where you get the food. Um, and an important lesson, I think, to for someone like me to keep in mind is, when I was growing up, the watchword was never don't go out and do that. When you talk about wisdom, the wisdom was watch for snakes.
Yeah.
Here's the sound that they make. Here's what they look like, the bad ones. Be able to differentiate between them. And until you can, make sure you run away. Don't pick them up until you learn one from another. Because, you know, the saying where I'm from is, you know, a white oak snake, they're so prevalent. They can't kill you, but they can make you kill yourself because you're so scared that it's a, you know, rattlesnake or something. So very young age, you learn that distinct, like the rattle, and you also start to learn how far off it potentially is. Like, is it echoing? Is it close by? Oh, we're in trouble. But in other words, it wasn't don't live life. It was pay attention to life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the quotidian, like pay attention in this moment. And so I told her, as we were like picking different vegetables and things, I said, you know, like it just was like I was just shoving the dirt. And as I like came up, I was like, most people our age don't even know what sowing and reaping means. Mm-hmm. Like, so the stories that almost all of our religious traditions are the sort of substrate for them. We are not in that world anymore. No, like we're in a different world. The entry into suffering and theodicy and all of that, for me, is you know, it was brought about by sudden and catastrophic illness. Yep. And I was bedridden for 3.5 years of my life before they figured out what was wrong and could even treat it. So I knew from my experience that people were going to lose their minds during the lockdowns, because
of course. Yeah.
And what people would say, like, you know, I'm afraid I'm going to lose it. Like, you will lose it, and then you'll find it again, and then you'll lose it again, and you'll find it again. And that sort of experience, suffering, it did put me in touch with like what you're describing as this, like, you can't make this thing happen.
No.
It's it is a happening. It's a between, among, above. That there were these temporal infinities. That's what I call, it's like this invasion of my space. Even in the most brutal moments of it, there were these lyrical moments that if I could attend to them, that's what created enough space in me to survive that minute.
Yeah.
And Frankel is the first person that I felt like understood me when he said in the concentration camps, a day lasted longer than a week. I was like, that's it. That's it. Because the name of the game was always just survive today. Just survive today. And in order to do that, there are levels of, I don't want to say, you would know better how to articulate this than me, but there's sort of a baseline consciousness that we think this is sort of it. This is my MO. This is how I operate. But then when you have ontological shock or something, this interruption, life interrupts you. Then you have to reorient yourself to this new state of consciousness.
Very much.
And the levels to which you have to go. And I mean, it hasn't been looked at enough. Dr. Baumeister is at FSU, and I reached out to him and just said, hey, look, I know you do all this work with experts. I was like, but has anyone ever looked at like capacity for suffering and competitive advantage? Like, what's the correlation? Is there a correlation between, say, someone who has, for like the Tour de France, like if you have an ability, if you have cultivated a capacity, just like a Buddhist monk has over the years intensely meditated on peace or harmony, like such that studies where these monks have been in a particular city meditating, like the crime rates will drop. Like, what does that mean? I don't know what that means, but it's a fascinating phenomenon, right? That is it just a happenstance? I don't know, but I wouldn't just pass that over like it's unimportant data. There is a level of consciousness that we can go to, and I think that it probably was possible for me to get there through different meditative states, potentially, I don't know. But what I do know is I got there this way, and all the way that I would describe it is like it was just daily having to make room in yourself for this crushing reality. Because it was either incorporated into you or be destroyed by it. And so I'm of a mind that there are things happening in this world that are just sort of, we're kind of grasping at. We don't have adequate, I guess, technology, metrics, abilities, articulation to even be able to start to talk about it. But I'm happy that there are people like you who are putting this out there that says like there's something that can happen just in this genuine interaction with us. Like we can get to a point in communing with one another, that again, this notion of remembering. And what you're saying, like the thought that came to my mind is there is a play on words here with like communion. As often as you do it in remembrance of me. Put this thing back together. Make it, you have to do this today. You can't exist on yesterday's bread. You have to do it new and afresh. And so rather than going the way of like the cyborg Messiah, I do think that there's a profundity to human beings that we don't quite fully appreciate, the vast continuum of what's possible, just our minds, what they're able to attune themselves to when put in different states. Let's say you're saying something that is challenging, and for people of faith, you could take it as an admonishment. I do think that the call to us, though, is to do what, like, say, Paul Vanderklay is doing. Honest to God, he could go right now, and I think he could do a PhD in your program. Like, he's so tuned into, like,
very much.
Yeah, I mean, like every video he puts out, like it just sort of one rung deeper. And I sent him a message one time. I was like, look, man, at this point, you're at least, you're prelim exam ready. Like, you're there.
I've told him that too, Kyle. I've told him that too.
I think so. And then look, what is one reason why I think that his message is resonating too is that he doesn't seem worried, because he's open and truthful about the fact that we all have meaning crises, and we all have what I want to call is like a superposition. I find myself sort of skeezed. I am in a superposition all of the time, both believing and doubting, all of the time.
Yes.
And I think that's
I think is a more honest. I think it's a more honest and humble way to be a human being, by the way.
And that's the thing is, you said something that just as a therapist, as a person, I mean, this should just be taught. But when you were talking about there's two different ways to be a bad funeral attendee. And one is to be the one who won't be with the person and be like, well, they're in glory now. So like, get on with the program. This is better for them that they died now. Or on the other side, get on with the business. Just get on with it. Nothingness, like it. Both are very, I feel like, obtuse, because
that's a good word for them. Yes.
If Christ is anything, I don't think he's repudiating what it means to be a human, what it must have cost. If you really think about this story and you say, if this were true, what would it cost a God to pack himself into a human form? What would that dimension reduction be like? Right? I mean, like Tron. What's like to Tron yourself down into this world? What would that cost you? So in order to do that, I don't think you would have someone who just sort of despises what it means to be human. I don't find that at all, and I find it appalling that Christ is calling you to deny your humanity. He's saying put on something else, cloak yourself with a different a glory that surpasses mere humanity. But don't be afraid of humanity. a person who touches a leper at that time is not someone who walks up to someone grieving at a funeral and says, "What's your problem? They're in heaven." Like,
Yeah.
no, he weeps. He fundamentally meets people where they are. And so I think that that's the sort of challenge for anyone who considers him or herself a person of faith, is to say, it doesn't much matter to me what team you say you're on, because in my version of this, it's non-rivalrous.
Yeah.
I need you to be at your best because I have a baby and we will have, Lord willing, more to follow. And I need everyone at their best. Someone said when you have a baby, you want to line the world with pillows so that it's safer for them, you know, but I need people like you calling people like me out and saying, you know, be mindful of this. Don't take it for granted that you just sort of resting on your laurels that yes, Christianity has sort of receded and resurrected in different contexts over a couple millennia. But that sort of lack of engagement with the world, I think, has been one of our downfalls, is to live now with people who are calling us to impart on this journey with them. We don't know where this is going, but like, I know I want to be along for the ride. I want to have conversations like this. I want to have to stretch myself and say, okay, you know, when my daughter looks back, this is what I was doing. Well, how does this change anything?
Yeah.
Well, my life has been changed profoundly by lectures. I mean, the Meaning Crisis series it's a masterpiece. And you know, I printed out the stack of transcripts.
Turning it into a book. It's actually 2 books, part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is probably we will literally be finishing it tomorrow. I'm working with Madeline Abramian, and we'll be done tomorrow, and it'll be ready to submit for publication. Way more figures, there's citations, the references, it extended, like I think a 40-page glossary of all the terms. Yeah, we're really enriching it.
Good luck with the book. I know it's going to be a page turner, and I hope a bestseller.
Well, that's not in my hands. I just hope it helps people. So that's all I'm looking for.
Well said. Bravo.
Take good care.